The morning of December 7, 1941, dawned clear and calm over Pearl Harbor. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed out of the Hawaiian sky, and in less than 2 hours, the United States would be irrevocably thrust into the greatest conflict humanity had ever known. But this story begins long before that Sunday morning, before the first bomb fell, before the first ship burned, before America's isolationist dream shattered in fire and smoke. The seeds of America's entry into World War II were planted in the ashes of the First Global War. When the Great War ended in 1918, over 116,000 American soldiers lay dead in European soil, and the nation recoiled in horror at the cost. The Senate's rejection of the League of Nations in 1920 wasn't merely a political decision, it was a declaration. America had seen the face of European power politics, and it wanted no part of it. Never again became the unspoken motto of an entire generation. Throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s, this sentiment hardened into policy. The Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937 weren't accidents of legislation. They were deliberate attempts to build legal walls between America and the conflicts brewing across both oceans. When Franklin Roosevelt signed these acts, he did so reluctantly, understanding that his hands were being tied by a Congress that reflected the deep isolationist current running through American society. In 1937, a Gallup poll revealed that 94% of Americans opposed involvement in foreign wars. This wasn't a slim majority, this was a national consensus. But the world was changing, whether America wanted to acknowledge it or not. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. In 1935, Mussolini's Italy attacked Ethiopia. In 1936, Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles while the world watched in paralysis. And in 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, finally triggering the declarations of war that would engulf Europe in flames. Roosevelt watched all of this with growing alarm. The president understood something that many of his countrymen did not, that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, vast as they were, could not protect America forever. He began a careful, calculated campaign to shift American policy from strict neutrality toward what he called all aid short of war to Britain and its allies. The Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 was the culmination of this effort, a program that would eventually provide over $50 billion worth of military aid to the Allies. But every step Roosevelt took toward supporting the Allies met fierce resistance. The America First Committee, founded in September 1940, grew to 800,000 members at its peak. Its most famous spokesman, aviator Charles Lindbergh, spoke to crowds of tens of thousands, warning that Roosevelt was leading America toward unnecessary war. The three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war, Lindbergh declared in a controversial speech, are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. The speech would later be condemned as anti-Semitic, but it reflected the raw emotions of a debate that was tearing America apart. In the Pacific, tensions with Japan had been building for years. Since 1937, Japan had been waging a brutal war in China, and American sympathies lay firmly with the Chinese. Roosevelt imposed increasingly strict economic sanctions on Japan, first on aircraft parts and aviation fuel, then on scrap metal, and finally, in July 1941, a complete oil embargo that threatened to strangle the Japanese war machine. American intelligence knew that Japan was planning some kind of military action, but where and when remained unclear. The Japanese leadership faced an impossible choice. Their oil reserves would last perhaps 18 months. They could either abandon their ambitions in China and Southeast Asia, something that was politically and strategically unthinkable, or they could strike southward to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. But such a move would leave their flank dangerously exposed to American forces in the Philippines and the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, proposed a bold solution, a surprise attack that would cripple American naval power in a single blow, buying Japan the time it needed to consolidate its conquests before America could respond. Yamamoto himself harbored deep doubts about war with America. He had lived in the United States, understood its industrial power, and reportedly told his superiors, "I can run wild for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." But the decision was made above his level. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese carrier task force slipped out of Haito Kappa Bay in the Kuril Islands and began its journey toward Hawaii, maintaining strict radio silence. In Europe, the situation had grown increasingly dire for Britain. The German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, had opened a new front that seemed destined to end in German victory. The Wehrmacht drove deep into Soviet territory, capturing millions of prisoners and advancing to within sight of Moscow by December. If the Soviet Union fell, Hitler would control resources from the Atlantic to the Urals. Britain would stand alone against a Nazi empire that spanned a continent. Winston Churchill understood that Britain could not survive alone indefinitely. British intelligence had broken German codes and knew the full extent of Nazi atrocities. Churchill needed America in the war, not as an arsenal, but as a combatant. In August 1941, he met with Roosevelt off the coast of Newfoundland to draft the Atlantic Charter, a statement of war aims for a conflict America hadn't yet joined. Churchill later wrote that he came away from that meeting believing that Roosevelt wanted war, but was constrained by American public opinion. Everything hung in the balance that autumn of 1941. In Washington, Japanese diplomats continued negotiations they knew were futile. In Berlin, Hitler watched the Eastern Front with growing concern as winter approached, and his armies remained locked in battle with stubborn Soviet resistance. In London, Churchill waited and hoped. And in the Pacific, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward Hawaii, carrying the fate of the world in their hangars. On the evening of December 6, 1941, Roosevelt received the first 13 parts of a 14-part Japanese diplomatic message that was clearly a rejection of American peace terms. He read it and reportedly said to his aide Harry Hopkins, "This means war." But neither he nor anyone else in American leadership knew that war was just hours away, that even as they slept, Japanese planes were being prepared for launch, that the carefully maintained peace was about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. At dawn on December 7, 1941, the Japanese strike force reached its launch point 230 miles north of Oahu. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda led the first wave of 183 aircraft into the sky. At 7:48 a.m., he sent the signal that would echo through history. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The code phrase meaning complete surprise had been achieved. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it ended, 2,403 Americans were dead, another 1,178 wounded. For battleships lay at the bottom of the harbor, for more were damaged. Aircraft were destroyed by the dozens. But the Japanese had missed 3 critical targets: Pearl Harbor's oil storage facilities, its repair shops, and, most importantly, the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea that day. The next morning, December 8, 1941, Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered a speech that would define his presidency and America's role in the war. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The vote for war was nearly unanimous. In the House, only Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana voted no, the same vote she had cast against entry into World War I. In the Senate, the vote was unanimous. 3 days later, on December 11th, Hitler made what many historians consider one of his greatest strategic blunders. He declared war on the United States, turning a Pacific conflict into a truly global war. America's entry transformed the war entirely. Its industrial capacity, already being mobilized to produce weapons for the Allies under Lend-Lease, shifted into high gear for direct combat. By 1943, American factories would be producing more war material than all Axis powers combined. American troops would fight in North Africa, Italy, France, and across the Pacific. American bombers would reduce German and Japanese cities to rubble. And ultimately, it would be American resources, American blood, and American atomic bombs that would force the Axis powers to unconditional surrender. This was the real timeline. This was how it happened. But what if it hadn't? What if that attack on Pearl Harbor had never come? What if the isolationists had won, and America had remained apart from the Great Conflagration? What if the United States had stayed out of World War II entirely? Before we explore what might have been, if you're enjoying this deep dive into alternative history, please subscribe to support more content like this. The point of divergence comes in the autumn of 1941, in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, during a series of meetings that would determine the fate of nations. In our timeline, these meetings ended with the decision to strike Pearl Harbor. But history turns on smaller hinges than we often imagine. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat before Emperor Hirohito and the Imperial Council on November 1, 1941, presenting his plan for the Pearl Harbor attack. In the real timeline, despite his private doubts, Yamamoto argued for the operation. But imagine if, in this moment, his reservations had won out. Imagine if he had spoken the full truth of what he believed, that war with America was unwinnable, that the attack on Pearl Harbor would awaken a sleeping giant, that Japan's only hope lay in a different path. Your Majesty, Yamamoto says in this altered timeline, his voice steady but firm, I must speak plainly. An attack on Pearl Harbor will not end American naval power, it will unleash it. The United States possesses 10 times our industrial capacity. We may win spectacular victories for 6 months, perhaps a year, but then their production will overwhelm us. Their carriers, which will certainly be at sea during any attack, will hunt our fleet across the Pacific. We will have traded a brief tactical advantage for certain strategic destruction. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo bristles at this assessment. Then what do you propose, Admiral? That we simply abandon our interests in China? That we surrender to American economic pressure? That would be intolerable dishonor. But Yamamoto has thought this through. Not surrender, Prime Minister. Strategic patience. We consolidate our holdings in China and Indochina. We do not strike the Americans, but neither do we retreat. We wait. The Americans are obsessed with events in Europe. Their attention is divided. If we avoid direct confrontation, their isolationist faction may yet prevail. Roosevelt cannot take his country to war without provocation. Without Pearl Harbor, he has no provocation. The debate rages for hours. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, who had always harbored doubts about war with America, sides with Yamamoto. The Admiral is correct, he argues. Look at Europe. The Soviet Union bleeds against Germany. Britain stands alone. If we bide our time, we may yet see a negotiated peace that leaves our position intact. But if we strike America, we unite their people against us in a way that Roosevelt has been unable to achieve. The decision hangs by a thread. In the real timeline, the war faction won. In this timeline, Yamamoto's persuasive power, combined with a slight shift in the emperor's inclination, tips the balance. The Pearl Harbor attack is postponed indefinitely. Japan will focus on consolidating its gains in China and preparing defenses in the Pacific, but it will not strike American territory. The Japanese carrier task force, already assembled and preparing to sail, is stood down. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who would have led the Pearl Harbor attack, instead finds himself drilling his pilots for operations that never come. The first bomb never falls. The ships in Pearl Harbor remain at their moorings, undisturbed. December 7, 1941, dawns like any other Sunday morning in Hawaii. When news of Japan's decision reaches Washington, Roosevelt is furious but powerless. He knows what Japan is doing, counting on American isolationism to paralyze American response. And the terrible truth is that Yamamoto's calculation is correct. Without a direct attack on American soil, Roosevelt cannot unite the country for war. The America First Committee seizes on Japan's restraint as vindication of their position. Japan has chosen prudence over aggression, Lindbergh tells cheering crowds. This proves that firm economic pressure, not military intervention, is the path to peace. Roosevelt maintains the oil embargo and continues to build up American forces in the Philippines, but these are defensive measures. He cannot order offensive action without congressional approval, and Congress remains firmly isolationist. In a private conversation with Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt unleashes his frustration. They're waiting me out. The Japanese know I can't move without an incident, and they're too clever to give me one. We're going to watch the world burn, Harry, and do nothing but sell fire insurance. In Europe, the consequences of America's continued neutrality become apparent with shocking speed. Without the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler has no reason to declare war on the United States. Lend-Lease continues, but it remains limited, controversial, and subject to constant political attack. American aid keeps Britain supplied, but not strong enough to threaten Germany. More critically, Stalin receives far less support than in our timeline. The winter of 1941-42 saves Moscow, just as it did historically. The Soviet counteroffensive drives the Germans back from the capital. But without the prospect of American entry into the war, Hitler does not make some of his most catastrophic strategic errors. He does not insist on holding every inch of ground at Stalingrad. He does not divide his forces in 1942 between the Caucasus oil fields and the symbolic target of Stalin's namesake city. Instead, German strategy remains focused and ruthlessly efficient. By the spring of 1942, the Eastern Front has stabilized along a line running roughly from Leningrad through Smolensk to Rostov. The Wehrmacht, though bloodied, remains intact. The Soviet Union, though undefeated, is exhausted. Neither side can achieve decisive victory, but Germany holds the advantage. It controls Ukraine's agricultural heartland and is positioned to strike toward the Caucasus oil fields when weather permits. In Britain, Churchill faces a political crisis. The Conservative Party is fragmenting. Lord Halifax and other appeasers argue for a negotiated peace. We cannot win this war alone, Halifax tells the cabinet in March 1942. America will not save us. The Soviets are bled white. Germany holds Europe from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. What precisely are we fighting for? To see London reduced to rubble while we achieve nothing. Churchill's response is defiant. We are fighting for civilization itself, for the idea that tyranny must not be allowed to triumph. Yes, the Americans have failed us. Yes, our position is desperate. But Britain does not surrender. We have not fought this far to bow before Hitler now. But Churchill's political position is weakening. In our timeline, American entry into the war ensured his dominance. In this timeline, each month without American support strengthens his opponents. By summer 1942, his government falls. Halifax becomes prime minister, with a mandate to seek peace. The negotiations begin in Geneva in August 1942, mediated by Switzerland and the Vatican. Hitler, sensing opportunity, proves surprisingly flexible. He has what he wants in Eastern Europe, Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. He is willing to guarantee the British Empire outside of Europe in exchange for recognition of German hegemony on the continent. The terms are harsh but not impossible. Britain will recognize German control of continental Europe, withdraw from all military operations, and reduce its military to purely defensive levels. In exchange, Germany will not invade Britain and will respect British colonial possessions. Churchill, now leading the opposition, rails against the treaty in Parliament. "You have accepted defeat," he thunders. "You have betrayed Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and every principle we claim to fight for. This is not peace. This is surrender dressed in diplomatic language. But the vote is not close. Britain is exhausted, bombed, and isolated. The Treaty of Geneva is ratified in September 1942. The European war is over, but not in the way anyone had hoped. If this alternate history is making you think about how fragile our world's path really is, consider subscribing to explore more untold stories of what might have been. The Pacific remains tense but quiet. Japan has not attacked American territory, so America and Japan remain technically at peace, though barely. The two nations watch each other across the Pacific like circling wolves, neither willing to make the first move. Japan consolidates its control over China and Southeast Asia. American forces in the Philippines go on high alert, but receive orders only to defend, never to attack. In the United States, the political landscape has shifted dramatically. The 1942 midterm elections are a disaster for Roosevelt. The isolationists win sweeping victories. In 1944, Roosevelt chooses not to seek a fourth term, exhausted by political battles and frustrated by his inability to act. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, leader of the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, wins the presidency on a platform of America First. His inaugural address in January 1945 celebrates American neutrality as a triumph of wisdom over warmongering. But in Europe, the celebration of peace is short-lived. With the Western Allies neutralized, Hitler turns his full attention eastward. The 1943 campaign season opens with Operation Citadel, a massive offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields. This time, without the strain of fighting on multiple fronts, without the need to guard against Allied invasion in the West, the Wehrmacht brings overwhelming force to bear. The battle is titanic. Soviet resistance is fierce. But by autumn 1943, German forces have captured Baku and severed the Soviet Union's primary oil supply. The impact is catastrophic. Soviet tanks, planes, and trucks begin running dry. Stalin orders desperate counterattacks, but without fuel, modern warfare becomes impossible. In January 1944, with Moscow facing a new German offensive and his forces literally grinding to a halt, Stalin faces the unthinkable. In a secret meeting with Molotov and Beria, the Soviet dictator, who had once said, "Not one step back," considers stepping back from everything. "We have lost 30 million people," he says, his voice hollow. "We cannot sustain this. The Americans have abandoned us. The British have surrendered. We stand alone against an enemy we cannot defeat." The Treaty of Minsk is signed in March 1944. The Soviet Union cedes Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus to German control. In exchange, the war ends. Stalin retreats behind the Urals, maintaining control of Siberia and the Far East, but European Russia falls under German domination. It is a defeat more total than anyone imagined possible. By the summer of 1944, Hitler stands triumphant. He controls Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. Britain has been neutralized. The Soviet Union has been defeated and partitioned. The United States remains distant and distracted. The Thousand-Year Reich seems not a boast, but a grim possibility. And in America, where citizens celebrate having avoided the terrible cost of war, few understand what has been lost. Few grasp that the world order has shifted beneath their feet. Few recognize that by choosing safety over sacrifice, they have allowed something monstrous to take root in the heart of civilization. The divergence is complete. The alternate path is set. But the story is far from over. The ripple effects of these choices, both taken and not taken, will reshape the world in ways no one in 1944 can yet imagine. The world of 1945 looks nothing like the one we know. There are no victory parades in Times Square, no photographs of sailors kissing nurses, no jubilant crowds celebrating the end of tyranny. Instead, there is an uneasy peace, a peace built not on justice but on exhaustion and calculation. The ripples of America's absence from World War II spread outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water, each one reshaping the future in ways both subtle and profound. In Europe, the Nazi Empire begins the grim work of consolidation. The Holocaust, which in our timeline was interrupted by military defeat, continues unabated. The death camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec operate until their horrific work is complete. By 1946, European Jewry has been nearly exterminated. Not 6 million dead, but 8 million, 9 million, perhaps more. The Romani people, the disabled, political dissidents, and countless others disappear into the machinery of genocide. Without Allied liberation, without the Nuremberg trials to expose these crimes to the world, the full scale of the horror remains hidden behind German propaganda and censorship. The territories conquered by Germany are reorganized according to Nazi racial ideology. Poland ceases to exist as a political entity. Its western regions are directly annexed into Germany, its people expelled or enslaved. Ukraine becomes a colonial breadbasket, its population reduced to agricultural serfdom. The Baltic states are emptied of their native populations and resettled with German colonists. This is General Plan Ost, the general plan for the East, implemented not as a fever dream, but as brutal reality. But the Nazi Empire faces challenges that ideology cannot solve. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, warns in private meetings that the conquered territories are economic disasters. Partisan warfare bleeds German resources. The enslaved populations sabotage production. The occupied lands require massive garrisons that cannot be sustained indefinitely. We have conquered an empire, Speer tells Goebbels in 1946, but we lack the population to hold it. We are stretched too thin. Hitler, aging and increasingly erratic, dismisses these concerns. In 1947, he orders the construction of Germania, a rebuilt Berlin that will serve as the capital of his empire, featuring buildings of staggering scale and monumental ugliness. The project consumes resources desperately needed elsewhere, but no one dares contradict the Führer. The cult of personality has become absolute. In Britain, the aftermath of the Treaty of Geneva brings bitter recrimination. Churchill leads the opposition with undiminished fire, but he is increasingly seen as a relic of a failed policy. The Halifax government focuses on rebuilding and preserving what remains of the British Empire. But that empire is crumbling. India, which contributed over 2 million soldiers to the war effort, demands independence. Without the moral authority gained from defeating fascism, Britain lacks the legitimacy to refuse. In 1946, India gains independence, not through negotiation with Attlee's Labour government as in our timeline, but extracted from Halifax's conservatives as the price of their neutrality. The dominoes continue to fall. Burma, Ceylon, Malaya all begin pushing for independence. The British Empire, preserved in Europe by the Treaty of Geneva, begins fragmenting in Asia and Africa. Halifax's government tries to hold on, but without American support and facing a resurgent Germany across the Channel, Britain simply lacks the power to maintain its global position. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's regime survives, but in a drastically reduced form. Control of Siberia and the Far East means the Soviet Union still exists, but it is a shadow of its former self. The loss of Ukraine's agricultural production and the Caucasus oil means chronic shortages. Stalin responds with characteristic brutality: more purges, more forced collectivization, more terror. But the Soviet Union of this timeline is not a superpower. It is a wounded giant, licking its wounds behind the Urals and plotting revenge it lacks the power to achieve. Stalin becomes obsessed with two things: nuclear weapons and infiltrating the Nazi regime. Soviet intelligence services, having successfully penetrated the Manhattan Project in our timeline, make similar efforts in this one. By 1949, the Soviet Union tests its first atomic bomb. But unlike in our timeline, this does not create a bipolar world. It merely ensures Soviet survival, not Soviet dominance. In Asia, Japan's empire faces its own contradictions. Without war with America, Japan controls China, Korea, Indochina, and much of Southeast Asia. But control is not stability. Chinese resistance, led by both communists and nationalists, continues to bleed Japanese resources. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, in an uneasy alliance, wage guerrilla warfare from bases in China's interior. The Japanese, stretched thin across their vast holdings, cannot crush the resistance completely. By 1948, the Japanese economy begins to strain. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's propaganda name for its empire, proves to be an extractive nightmare that generates hatred rather than cooperation. Without the industrial stimulus of total war, Japan's economy grows, but not at the miraculous pace seen in our post-war timeline. And without defeat and American occupation, Japan's militaristic government remains in power, pursuing policies that alienate its neighbors and impoverish its subjects. And what of America? The United States of this timeline is prosperous, but haunted. The economy, never fully mobilized for war, experiences steady growth without the explosive industrial expansion of 1941 to 45. Unemployment remains higher than in our timeline. The GI Bill never happens, because there are no GIs returning from overseas. The great social changes catalyzed by war, women entering the workforce en masse, African Americans demanding civil rights after serving their country, occur more slowly, if at all. The isolationist victory in 1944 proves Pyrrhic. By 1947, even Robert Taft acknowledges that America cannot simply ignore the world. A Nazi-dominated Europe and Japanese-controlled Asia mean American trade is constrained, American values are mocked, and American security is ultimately threatened. But having chosen non-intervention, America finds it difficult to reverse course. What moral authority does America possess to challenge tyranny abroad when it stood aside while tyranny triumphed? The Cold War of this timeline is not between democracy and communism, but between fascism and everyone else. The main antagonists are Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, both ruling vast empires through force and terror. The United States and the Soviet Union find themselves in the strange position of tacit allies against the Axis powers, not out of affection, but from necessity. The nuclear age arrives, but without the same moral clarity. The United States develops atomic weapons by 1945, just as in our timeline. But there is no Hiroshima, no Nagasaki, no demonstration of nuclear horror that shocks the world into seeking arms control. Instead, nuclear weapons simply become another tool of statecraft. By 1950, Germany has the bomb. By 1951, so does Japan. The world now has 4 nuclear powers, none bound by the taboos established in our timeline. The space race begins differently. In our timeline, it was a Cold War competition between superpowers. In this timeline, it begins in 1952 when Nazi scientists, working under the direction of Wernher von Braun, who never defected to America, successfully launched the first artificial satellite. It is named Siegfried, and its radio signal beeping across the heavens is heard as a taunt to the rest of the world. Germany has reached the stars first. This galvanizes American efforts. The United States, still possessing substantial technical expertise, pours resources into its own space program. But without the unifying purpose provided by World War II, without the sense of moral mission, the space program struggles to capture public imagination. It is seen as prestige competition with a distasteful regime, not as a noble endeavor. By 1955, the world has settled into a grim equilibrium. Germany dominates Europe and Western Russia. Japan controls much of Asia and the Pacific. The Soviet Union, reduced but nuclear-armed, controls Siberia. The United States, wealthy but isolated, dominates the Americas. Britain clings to fragments of its empire and tries to balance between the powers. This is not a world order based on law or justice, but on spheres of influence and the threat of nuclear annihilation. The human cost is staggering. In Europe, millions live under totalitarian rule. The concentration camps have officially closed, their work complete, but forced labor camps for political prisoners and subject populations remain. The Nazi Empire is maintained by systematic brutality. In Asia, Japanese occupation breeds constant resistance and brutal repression. The death toll from continuous small wars, purges, and repression in both empires runs into the tens of millions. Resistance movements operate in both empires, but without external support, they struggle to achieve more than symbolic victories. In Poland, the Home Army fights on from the forests, sabotaging German installations. In China, communist and nationalist guerrillas control vast rural areas. But these are wars of attrition with no clear end. The culture of this alternate world reflects its darkness. Literature, art, and film from the democratic nations are marked by pessimism and existential dread. George Orwell writes 1984 in 1948, just as in our timeline, but the novel reads not as dystopian fiction, but as documentary. His warning about totalitarianism isn't a cautionary tale about possible futures. It's a description of the present. The book is banned in Germany and Japan, naturally, but becomes a sensation in America and Britain, where readers recognize the world Orwell describes. In America, a new generation comes of age, one that knows only the peace purchased by inaction. By the late 1950s, young Americans begin questioning the choices their parents made. A counterculture emerges, not around opposition to war as in our 1960s, but around guilt at having avoided it. How can we claim moral authority? Writes a young journalist named Tom Hayden in 1959. When we stood aside while evil triumphed, we chose prosperity over principle, and now we live in a world where tyranny is normalized. The civil rights movement develops differently. Without the catalyst of African-American military service in World War II, without the moral momentum gained from defeating racist fascism abroad, the movement for racial justice in America progresses more slowly. But by 1960, it can no longer be denied. Martin Luther King Jr. rises to prominence, and his message resonates with particular power. We cannot lecture the world about freedom when we deny it at home. We cannot claim to stand for justice when injustice flourishes in our own land. The 1960 presidential election becomes a referendum on America's role in the world. John F. Kennedy, too young to have fought in World War II, that never happened for America, campaigns on a message of renewed engagement. We face a world divided between freedom and tyranny, he says in his announcement speech. Our parents' generation chose to stand apart. They hoped that tyranny would somehow defeat itself. It did not. Now we must decide, will we continue to watch, or will we finally act? Kennedy wins narrowly, and his inauguration in January 1961 marks a turning point. His inaugural address is remembered for one line that captures the zeitgeist. Let every nation know that we will pay any price, bear any burden, to ensure that freedom does not perish from this earth, even though we failed to pay that price 20 years ago. But Kennedy inherits a world far more dangerous than the one of our timeline. Germany and Japan are nuclear-armed empires. The Soviet Union is paranoid and aggressive. Proxy conflicts simmer everywhere. The Berlin crisis of 1961 in our timeline becomes the Warsaw Crisis in this one, as Germany tightens its grip on occupied Poland and the United States, finally moved to action, threatens consequences. The Cuban Missile Crisis has a parallel in 1962, but the details are different. In this timeline, a Soviet attempt to place nuclear missiles in Alaska, in a region that borders Soviet Siberia, brings the world to the brink. Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiate a settlement, but it is complicated by German and Japanese involvement. The world has not two nuclear powers but four, and crisis management becomes exponentially more complex. By the mid-1960s, cracks appear in both fascist empires. Germany faces economic stagnation, political succession crises, and growing resistance movements. Hitler dies in 1965. In this timeline, he lived longer, his illness progressing more slowly without the stress of losing a war. His death triggers a power struggle between Göring, Himmler, and Speer. The Nazi regime begins to fracture. In Japan, the costs of maintaining a vast empire become unsustainable. The war in China has never ended, and by 1966, it is obvious that Japan cannot win. Mao's communist forces control the countryside, and even with Japanese air superiority, they cannot be dislodged. The Japanese economy, strained by decades of military spending, begins to contract. The late 1960s see the beginning of what historians will call the Great Unraveling. In 1968, Czechoslovakia, absorbed into the Greater German Reich in 1939, rises in revolt. The Prague Spring of this timeline is brutally suppressed by German forces, but the images of tanks crushing protesters galvanize world opinion. Kennedy, now in his second term, imposes harsh economic sanctions on Germany. The Soviet Union, seeing opportunity, supports the Czech resistance with weapons and intelligence. In 1969, China achieves what had seemed impossible. A unified resistance movement defeats Japanese forces in a decisive battle at Nanjing. The Japanese, overstretched and facing economic crisis, begin withdrawing from mainland China. Mao Zedong enters Beijing in triumph in October 1969, and the People's Republic of China is proclaimed, 20 years later than in our timeline, and forged in the fires of a much longer struggle. The 1970s become a decade of reckoning. The fascist empires, which had seemed permanent fixtures of the post-war world, begin to crumble. Internal contradictions, economic failures, and popular resistance prove that tyranny, even nuclear-armed tyranny, cannot sustain itself indefinitely. But the cost has been staggering. The death toll from the Nazi and Japanese empires, including the Holocaust, forced labor, famines, and constant repression, exceeds 100 million people. In Germany, a reform movement emerges in 1972, led by younger technocrats who recognize that the empire is unsustainable. Helmut Schmidt, a Wehrmacht veteran turned reformer, argues for realism. We can maintain the form of empire, he tells the Reichstag, or we can maintain the substance of German prosperity. We cannot do both. The hardliners resist, but by 1975, economic reality forces change. Germany begins withdrawing from its eastern territories, not out of moral awakening, but from practical necessity. The transition is chaotic and violent. As German forces withdraw, ethnic conflicts erupt across Eastern Europe. Poles seek revenge against German colonists. Ukrainians fight Russians. The Balkans descend into warfare. The United Nations, weaker in this timeline, having been born without American leadership, struggles to manage the humanitarian crises. By 1980, the world map is being redrawn. Poland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Belarus regain independence, though their territories are devastated and their populations traumatized. The Holocaust is finally fully exposed as archives open and survivors testify. The scale of the genocide shocks even those who suspected the worst. The Nuremberg-style trials that should have happened in 1945 finally occur in 1981-82, but many of the worst perpetrators are long dead, and justice feels hollow and belated. In Asia, Japan's empire similarly collapses. Korea achieves independence in 1973. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia break free in 1974-75, but without the American intervention of our timeline, the outcomes are different. Communist movements triumph, but they are less aligned with the Soviet Union and more nationalist in character. The domino theory proves partly correct, but the dominoes fall in unexpected directions. The United States of 1985 is a superpower, but a haunted one. It possesses vast military and economic power, but its moral authority is compromised by the knowledge that it stood aside during humanity's darkest hour. American historians debate endlessly the what-ifs of 1941. What if Roosevelt had found a way to bring America into the war? What if Pearl Harbor had happened as it did historically? How many millions of lives might have been saved? These questions torture the American conscience. In schools, children learn about the Great Abdication, the choice to stay out of World War II, as the defining mistake of the 20th century. The lesson seems clear. Isolation is not safety, neutrality in the face of evil is complicity, and the price of avoiding war can be higher than the price of fighting it. The European Union that forms in the 1990s of this timeline is built not on the ashes of a defeated Germany, but on the ruins of a German empire that collapsed from within. The process is messier, slower, and more contested. Germany itself is divided, not between East and West as in our timeline, but between those who cling to fantasies of past glory and those who seek to build a democratic future. The reunification of Europe takes not decades but generations. The Soviet Union of this timeline never became a superpower and therefore never experiences the same kind of collapse as in our 1991. It remains a significant power, controlling Siberia and gradually reintegrating with some former Soviet republics as the German threat recedes. But it is not the USSR of our Cold War. It is smaller, weaker, and less ideologically driven. Communism as a global movement never achieved the same prominence without the prestige of having defeated fascism. As the 21st century dawns, the world is more multipolar, more unstable, and more scarred by history. There are more nations, more competing powers, and more unresolved conflicts. The Middle East is different. Without American involvement in World War II, the support for Israel develops differently, and the region's conflicts follow alternative paths. Africa's decolonization is messier, with European powers clinging longer to their holdings without the moral reckoning that followed their liberation in our timeline. Technology has developed, but differently. The massive technological leap driven by World War II in our timeline, radar, computers, antibiotics, nuclear power, jet engines, occurred more slowly without the urgency of total war. The computer revolution arrives in the 1980s rather than the 1960s. The internet emerges in the 1990s, but it is less American-dominated, more fragmented by national boundaries and competing technical standards. The world of 2025 in this alternate timeline is one where the United States is a great power, but not the hegemon it became in our timeline. China is a rising power, having emerged from Japanese occupation to build a new nation. Germany is democratic, but smaller and less influential. Russia, never the Soviet superpower, is a regional power. Japan, having lost its empire, underwent economic and political transformation, but without the American occupation that shaped its democracy in our world. Perhaps most significantly, the world lacks the institutions and norms built in our timeline from the ashes of World War II. The United Nations is weaker. NATO never formed as we know it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has less force. The Geneva Conventions were never strengthened by the trials of Nazi war criminals. The international order is more anarchic, more driven by national interest, less constrained by shared values forged in the crucible of fighting fascism together. And every nation carries its own burden of regret. Britain regrets the Treaty of Geneva. The Soviet Union mourns the territories lost in the Treaty of Minsk. The resistance movements of Europe and Asia mourn the decades spent fighting without support. And America, prosperous, powerful America, carries the heaviest burden of all, the knowledge that it could have acted, should have acted, but chose not to. That when the world needed leadership, it chose isolation. That when the choice was between sacrifice and safety, it chose safety. And that millions died because of that choice. In the history books of this alternate 2025, World War II is not remembered as the good war or the war that saved civilization. It is remembered as the war where civilization nearly died because the world's most powerful democracy stood aside. The victory over fascism, when it finally came decades later, was not clean or complete. The scars remain, the dead cannot be returned, and the lesson is written in blood. That neutrality in the face of evil is not noble restraint but moral failure. That isolation is a luxury the powerful cannot afford, and that sometimes the cost of avoiding war is far higher than the cost of fighting it. The lesson was learned, but it was learned too late. And the world that emerged from those choices is darker, more divided, and more tragic than the one we know. This is the price of what might have been, the ripple effects of one choice, one moment, one divergence from the path of history. This is what happens when America stays out of World War II entirely. And in the end, the question remains, was the peace purchased by isolation worth the price paid by the world?